Have you ever noticed how we've created a world that's supposed to make life easier, but somehow we're all more stressed and disconnected than ever? For neurodivergent individuals especially, the impact on mental health can be significant. In this episode, I'm joined by Damilare Adeyeri, who spends a lot of time thinking about how we've traded movement for screens and how this trade-off is affecting our brains. We'll dive into why getting up and moving might just be one of the best things we can do for our mental health and resilience. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here with us today. We're going to dive into a really important topic about burnout, resiliency, and what it takes not just to survive, but thrive in this tough, high-pressure world we're living in. I'm really excited to be joined by Damilare Adeyeri. He's a keynote speaker and a peak performance coach, and recently an Ironman triathlete. So he knows a thing or two about pushing limits. And he spent years motivating people all over the world and really trying to help them unlock their potential, boost their energy, and ultimately perform at their best. So today we're going to talk about these things, get some of his insights on how to manage our mental health, build resilience in this stressful world, and more importantly, bounce back from burnout if we land there. So Damilare, thanks so much for being here today. I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Haskins. I'm here. I'm excited.
So I really want to start by hearing a bit about your journey. I really found it fascinating, so I think the audience will too, about how you got into this peak performance coaching and how that's shaping your work to help people build some resilience to prevent burnout.
Fantastic. So sometimes in life, you choose a path, and sometimes a path chooses you. And for me, I would say in many ways, my path chose me. Growing up, I always knew I wanted to help people in some form or shape, right? And so that path took me into wanting to become a medical doctor, actually. I started out doing a bachelor's in microbiology, fun fact, yeah. And along that way, I realized that less about the sample collection and the blood and all the other fun stuff of the hospital, and more about the psychology of behavior and our connections and just what makes us who we are. In other words, the human connection. And so that led me through different paths, which included eventually a master's in cross-cultural and international education and a coach training through the Tony Robbins and Chloe Madanes Coach Training Institute, and eventually to actually working one-on-one with clients to help them unlock their potential, help them move forward in different challenges that they may be facing in their life. And along the way, having fun, which when I say having fun is the movement part, right? Because I also enjoy moving. I have another master's in dance, knowledge, practice, and heritage side by side with my other qualifications, and got some fitness educations along the way too. So when you bring all of that together, for me is the mind-body connection, right? So we're looking at emotions, we're looking at the mind, we're also looking at how our body all impact our ability to perform, right? So that's kind of like a quick breeze through of how I got here.
And you do focus a lot on movement, so much that you mentioned Tony Robbins. You've been on the big stage as the
Correct.
energizer for his events, and you recently did a TEDx talk on the importance of movement and mental well-being. Do you find that that is a catalyst that you use often with clients or people that are feeling down?
Absolutely. So here's the way it happens, right? So the Western world, now I'm going to generalize, often focuses on the cognitive, right? The mental learning and everything, mostly from the mind. However, the totality of who we are, it's not just the mental cognition, right? There is the body. And the body turns out to be the quickest way to change how we are feeling, because simple movements of moving the body, like we've learned from exercise science, increases blood rate, right? Increases circulation. And by increasing circulation, your body is in a much more alert or energy state, which as a benefit, focus, emotional boost, productivity, all of that comes in simply because it's also releasing the endorphins, which is the happy hormones, right? And so I have found movement to be a very powerful vessel that is actually rarely used. I mean, just simply standing up to stretch in between a task shifts our energy state, shifts our mood. And, so for me, I have learned that movement is usually the first and often most potent way to shift an emotional state.
And I think it's an interesting thing, because if I think about my own day, and if my listeners are honest with themselves, how much of your day do you spend sitting in one place staring at a screen? And besides like getting up to get a coffee, how much movement are you really doing? And when you really reflect on it, I mean, some people may only be moving feet a day, let alone 3,000 to 10,000 steps. And so
yeah,
I wonder, like, we talk about burnout and high performance, but is it also like a cultural shift of we're just glued to sit and stare?
Correct. I mean, so I was hearing a speaker say some time ago that we live a boxed life. Right? We live in our boxed house, move from our boxed house into our boxed car, from our boxed car to our boxed office, from our boxed office to the boxed grocery store, get back home and pick up, you open your boxed fridge to pick out your boxed meal. Right? And everything is really, really very contained. And that also somehow also affects our mind and emotions, because now it fits within the parameters of trying to keep everything constrained, right? And so you were saying earlier on, like, sitting on the decks, watching the screen and a box in our hand, our devices, all of that stuff ends up keeping us very sedentary. And by being sedentary, you are not getting the maximum ability of your blood flow, right? You're not getting the maximum ability of your joints, your movement, your muscles, all those things which are there to serve a function. And part of that function is to help you feel good.
Yeah. And if you think about it, we have increased connectivity, as you were saying from the beginning, cognitively, like we're doing this podcast, we're 1,000 miles away from each other. But yet We're in a box, we're in our rooms, we're in a screen, right? We're sedentary. So there's this interesting thing about technology is helping facilitate connection, but at the same time, it's also starting to lead to the physiological effects of stress that we're not even necessarily realizing that our engagement are causing.
Correct. So the way I would look at it is what I'll say mental overload. Right. So yes, technology is facilitating connectivity. It is not necessarily facilitating connection, because connection goes beyond just talking to each other. Connection goes deeper into our presence, and our presence is also then the emotional connection, right? So how do you transcribe that? And also, technology has a tendency to be very one way in which we are consuming content rather than an exchange. So if I were to be watching a show or watching a webinar or listening to a podcast, I am taking in information, which is great, right? However, there's no in and out. And so just by a factor of nature, when there's a pouring into a container, it overflows, right? It becomes so stuffed in. And that mental, overload is part of what causes the stress for us, because now it almost feels like, I can't take it anymore. I'm watching the news. I'm listening to more information everywhere. I'm consuming content from social media. I'm consuming content from my work, and I'm not having that release.
And so we're seeing burnout. We actually are seeing...
And we're seeing burnout.
We're seeing mental health issues higher today than they were during COVID, which was an extremely stressful time. So it's increasing. And I know that it's also, we're seeing more the neurodivergent population talking about burnout too, maybe for the same or different reasons. But in your experience, I think you're seeing more burnout with your clients. What are the triggers that they're expressing beyond what we just talked about, where it's like you're in a container, you need to release? But what are some other triggers that you're seeing that are really leading to this concept of just overall fatigue and burnout that we're seeing?
Right. So, without getting so much into the medical part of it, unexplained headaches, right? Unexplained headaches typically are, one of the first signs of you're pushing yourself too hard, right? Something in your biological system is telling you there's a problem. When you get to the emotional, psychological part of it, is just not feeling like you can give more. It's a sign of burnout, right? When you're feeling uninterested, the things that you've been interested in before suddenly feel boring, like you don't want to do it anymore. The places you've gone before, the people you're hanging out with before, all of that suddenly feels like an extra work. And that's the body going into shock, saying, I don't want any more of these things, right? It's a sign of burnout. And then, and part of the sign of burnout is actually similar to signs of depression too, right? Where there's a loss of appetite. It's like you don't want to eat. Or on the other end, it goes to overeating, right? So it could be, but extremes that deviate from, and when I say normalcy, it's that deviate from what is being normal to you as an individual, what has been a regular routine or pattern for you in your healthier state. So I would say any deviation from that should be checked as a possible sign of burnout.
And what I think is interesting as you were talking is, you mentioned that one some of the first things, the headache, upset stomach, eating, not eating enough, either direction. But then there's that pulling back from things that you enjoy. And I know in my experience in talking with people, they'll be like, well, I don't have time for that anymore, because it's almost like they redirect their energy often to the source that's burning them out. Like you almost become hyper consumed with fixing that, and then you pull away from some of the very things that probably could help you decompress. What do you think that's about?
It's the pressure to perform. It's the feeling of a lack of control. And it depends on where that's coming from. If that's coming from a job, in that moment, there's the pressure that XYZ is tied to my ability to show up in this instance. It could be financial income. It could be societal expectations. It could be connected to family, right? And so in the larger scale of things, in that moment, the individual is thinking of all the things that could possibly go wrong if and when I don't show up to these things. And so I'll rather push myself even harder to be in these places and things without recognizing that it's actually burning me out. It's actually stressing me out more than usual. And should I get to a place where I'm unable to do this anymore, secret, life moves on. Life really moves on. And so, but in the moment, we're not thinking about that. In the moment, there's that pressure to perform. There's the expectation. There's the push that, I cannot afford to take a break because of XYZ.
And they end up pushing their families away, their friends away, pretty much their coping mechanisms. And then if and when they just hit a wall, they almost find out they are alone and isolated because they isolated themselves in this goal to be perfect.
Correct. And so, I know we're still talking about burnout as an issue itself. It's a great segue into thinking about how to prevent it, because it goes side by side. And I say to treat life as a marathon, not a sprint. Treat life as a marathon, not a sprint. Because when you look at exercise science and we do high intensity interval training, you can only sustain maximum effort for so long before the body goes into a shock. No one can literally do it. However, if your maximum effort will be in what is called an anaerobic, energy setup. However, if you were working out in your aerobic energy capacity, you could go for longer times, right? So if you were to bring that into life and you treat it as a marathon, when you're able to conserve your energy or perform at a level where you can sustain it over a long period, it's a much more helpful and overall healthier approach than pushing yourself harder on a go, but then burning out in between. Right. And so, and another thing you think about is something that we say all the time in endurance training and semi-marathons. It's like drink before you're thirsty. Drink before you're thirsty. Right. Because the moment you're thirsty, then the body is already starting to go into shock mode, right? Like, hey, what's going on? So it's like building practices along the way that help us take those breaks in between, move our body in between, take a deep breath, connect with our family and friends, do things that bring us joy as we also perform our tasks, so that we don't get into the point where we hit the wall and realize that we already excommunicated everybody else and already pushed ourselves into shock.
So there's a bit of mindfulness here, because it's really taking the tack. And I'm guilty of it. You may have been guilty of it at some point, maybe not, because you're mindful. But where something's happening on, and maybe somebody in your family, your kids want your attention, you're like, I'm busy now. And to be mindful of like, yes, you may be busy now, but could that busy wait 5 minutes, or could that busy wait till tomorrow? Because this, like when you really peel it back, and we've all seen, and heard it, where they say no one's going to ever wish they worked more, but yet we're sucked into the work cycle and we tend to deprioritize. Like when I say it that way, people are like, I would never deprioritize my family. We tend to deprioritize our families all the time because we feel in our hearts they'll always be there. But yet that's the very activities we should be like prioritizing more. It's just weird. And I don't know if it's a Western culture thing, but I do feel like we're so worried about the paycheck and the work and the prestige and the achievement that we forget that the things that actually bring us the most joy are the love and the connections and our family. And I see it all the time. People calling in when they're at their kid's soccer game because there's a meeting. Like, was it really that important that you couldn't be present in that moment?
Right. Yeah. And you're spot on. Like mindfulness, yes. And, I'll expand that to say living with intentionality. Right. And so to live with intention is deciding ahead of time what's most important to you and structuring your life in such a way that you could give your time and attention to those things. It's pretty much living out your values. Right. And so, yes, we say family is important to us. And at the same time, do we intentionally structure our lives such that, okay, I'm going to have this much undivided time with family? Which also then leads to another concept of boundaries, right?
And I can hear people listening to us going, yeah, Damilare, Theresa, I hear you, but my boss said I have to be there. Like the pressures that you're feeling out there are real. Like it is like, it's hard to set boundaries, or you may feel it's hard to set boundaries when you have people that control your paycheck or control your promotion, putting on pressures. But at the same time, if you do form boundaries respectfully, or you work through them, I found that bosses will usually respect it. Some of the strategies I've used in the past is if you don't have email notifications turned on, you don't know you have the email till you come back to the office on Monday morning.
Right.
I find that most people won't text you. They'll send the email, but they won't text you. Now, not every work culture is that way, but what are things that, like, I feel like some people feel it's a privilege to have a boundary, where other people feel, I hear the word and I think of that movie, Devil Wears Prada, where she's like, I don't have a choice. I have to take this call. I don't have it, right? Like, her boss was a tyrant, right? Calling her at all hours, asking her to do these crazy things. And she started to have issues in her relationships. I like using media because that way we can talk about it and it's nobody's personal information. But she, had problems where they're like, the person whose phone call you're taking is who's actually important to you. And she said millions of times in that movie, I don't have a choice. I don't have a choice. I have to do this. I don't have a choice. Until at the end, she realized she could choose.
Yeah.
It just may mean exiting this work environment. So it is harder sometimes done.
Correct. It is harder done. And when we realize that everything we're doing is either pulling us towards something or away from something, we would realize that the consequences may not be as worse as we are imagining them to be. When I imagine having to set a boundary at work, then the fear of, they're going to think I'm lazy or not a productive team member. Okay, say they think about that. What is the consequence? They may think about transferring to another department. Okay, what is the consequence? They may eventually fire me. Okay, how likely is it that they're going to fire you? What are the steps in, the company, the HR, whatever it is, that eventually lead to someone being fired? What does your work contract say in terms of your hours and the production of work, right? And so if we can drill it down to really what the facts is, you are actually overperforming. And you've not allowed yourself those breaks in between. And I've seen this with myself, having previously worked in a corporate organization and also too with other connections to me. The more you give, the more been requested of you. That's a fact. Like, the more I give into anything, the more that thing demands more of me, right? And so along the way, it becomes my identity because I'm good at it, right? I like to do it. I like the feedback that comes like, oh, great job, Damilare. Or, I like the money that I get from some extra work. And ultimately, now I do not see myself dissociated from that work, that task, that project. And that in itself causes challenges. So yes, it is harder done. However, it's not impossible if we can step back to really look at the situation and say, there are actually more windows of opportunity in this situation than I have let myself consider. So the question always is, what is the price I'm willing to pay to be who I want to be or to get what I want?
And I think as you were talking, and at the beginning, you talked about the importance of movement that increases endorphins. And then you were talking about the recognition, and that creates a different type of endorphin, but it's actually probably shorter lived. And that constant seeking for approval and feeling valued, that when you've become an overachiever and that became your brand potentially with the company, now it's like, well, if I step back from that in any capacity, are they going to think less of me? When you created the construct half the time, that set the expectation of, give it to Damilare, he can do it. And then I think what happens is people realize they can't maintain the construct they created by their ability to always step up. They'll see other people, like, so you're working till 8:00 at night, but Bob is taking his son to the soccer game, and he'll be like, well, here, you do this because I have something to do. And then it builds this resentment. And so you're like, how do they have life balance and I don't have life balance? And I see it all the time where it's like, what do you mean they can't come to a meeting? We're all at the meeting. And that's because that person created a priority value. Like maybe they won't get the promotion, but they made their kid's soccer game.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's redefining success.
Yes.
And especially in the US, I think that success really, people's identities tend to lean towards their work. When you ask somebody about themselves, the first thing they usually tell you is their job title, which is so weird because in other areas of the world, they do not do that.
Yep. Yeah, and it's the way society is currently structured. And yes, that makes it harder for us. And that also is not a reason that we must conform, right? Because if we're thinking differently, if we're acting differently, then we're also starting to challenge some of these societal norms that make work the definition of our person. There's a drive for more. Yes, I'm a peak performance coach. Yes, are there limits that we place on ourselves that sometimes are really just limits? Yes. At the same time, why more? What is that more for? Right? And what are you paying for it? You talk about me doing an Ironman. Yes, I did an Ironman. I completed it. I also recognize that during the time I was training for an Ironman, I was spending between 10 to 20 hours a week training. That was time that was not going to other things in my life, right? And so where did I make that time? Well, maybe I slept a little less. Okay, maybe not the best. In that season, I had a goal, right? And so also thinking in mind that sometimes when you have a big goal, you make shifts. However, long-term, it's not, except to make a lifestyle out of the things you prioritize. It's not. And I was talking to a friend of mine who I asked her, I said, okay, well, you were one of the best runners I know in our team when it comes to running triathlons, right? You swim, you bike, but then when you get to the run, you were like Flash. How do you make time for training? And she said, well, I decided to design my life in a way where I only work 30 hours a week. And I'm able to work 30 hours a week so that I have more time for training. I also have time for my kids, right? Now, is there somewhat a limit to the income she's making? Yes. However, when you look at the overall quality of life, is she in a better place? I would think so. And so again, the question is, what price are you willing to pay? Are you willing to pay the price of burnout such that you get to a place where even that extra dollar you make, you're not in a physical health state to enjoy it, or that ends up going to the medical system, medical industry? Or are you finding that balance between the life where, I'm able to work? And I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for 30 hours a week. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm advocating for an integration of your life, of our lives, where we're able to work and live. Because at the end of the day, we don't live to work, we work to live.
Right. Well, that's what you would think. Doesn't always feel that way. As you were talking, and we were kind of thinking about that identity that's tied to things, it leans me to my neurodivergent population that they're so focused on just getting in and being accepted. So they tend to run into burnout faster because in addition to everything that the normative population is feeling, because burnout's all over the place, then
Right.
This population's like, to be successful, not only am I doing everything that Theresa and Damilare just talked about, but now I have to pretend to fit in and I have to try to hide myself or fight for acceptance or fight for accessibility. So there's this whole other layer that they're feeling. And in this achievement culture where it's almost like a prototype of what success looks like, it's exhausting. It's exhausting for all of us. But that population is like some opt in and some opt out, right? Where they're like, and the ones that opt out are the ones that we're getting the reports of lack of employment and struggles because they can't sustain the mask. They can't sustain the vicious cycle that has been created. I would hope, though, that if any of them are listening to this talk today, that you're really not alone in this cycle, but you do have some additional barriers. So when we think about I like this idea of like really prioritizing your life. And then I really like how you were talking about, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the thought process where you start creating like a fatalistic view where it's like you catastrophize what could happen. And it hasn't even happened yet. So it's like,
Right.
if I tell my boss I want to leave early to take my kids to soccer, they're going to think less of me. Like there's all these things. And it's like the lies we tell ourselves that then create stress. And so we try to mitigate the stress by, instead of having the conversation to determine whether it's even true, we just prevent the conversation by saying, I'll just work.
Right. So you mentioned asking those questions, right? Like when we're thinking about what's the worst that could happen. And there are actually three questions that I often ask my clients. Yes, the first one is, what is the worst that could happen? Right. And so bring it to the surface, bring the perceived fears to the surface, identify it, because once you don't bring it out to the surface, you can't really question it. Okay. So what is the worst that could happen? Then the second question is, what is the best that could happen? Right. Because we're so focused on the worst or how things could go wrong that we've forgotten that there are actually benefits to what we're considering too. So what is the best that could happen? And the third question is, what is most likely to happen? Right? So looking at the situation, because all of these three questions are still in your thoughts. The worst that could happen, the best that could happen, what is most likely to happen. However, what is most likely to happen is closest to reality, because hopefully you have situation or context or facts to predict why you think that's more likely to happen. And so the way forward, more often than not, is if you can live with the worst that could happen, more like it's not going to kill you, right? And you indeed want the best that could happen, then you owe it to yourself to move forward, right? Because you know that it's become a calculated risk. Living in itself is a risk. And so we're not insulated from risk by just living. Now, we don't want to do stupid things, but at the same time, we want to be able to take risks because that's how we grow. And so, when you bring it to the neurodivergent population and the additional stresses that come from not being accepted and the pressure to perform, to act in a normative way or similar normative way, then I would say, and again, food for thought, is to consider, are you in the right environment? Right? Are you in the right environment that celebrates your strengths? Are you in the right environment that identifies what you're good at and gives you more opportunity to use that versus an environment that is focused on the deficit? Right? The other thing too is, and again, it's harder done, but not impossible, is what opportunities may exist to run a business rather than be employed
by others.
Right? So that's another thing. And I love teams, human teams, because we all bring diverse strengths to the team. And so rather than a pressure on an individual to produce a certain outcome, a team is stronger to produce it because there are diverse strengths within the team. So are there opportunities to work in a team where different people are contributing to the overall output? Just some things to consider.
Which would be ideal.
Correct.
And so we know that physical movement helps us. So it's like you're feeling stressed, go take a walk. You want to change something because maybe you have identified that this is what I feel is leading to my burnout. And you think about best case, if I ask for a change or I make a change, the worst case. I do find, especially my ADHD population, they tend to dwell and they tend to stick on the worst case scenario. This is when I think this concept of mindfulness and exercise are important because it's like they need to be mindful when their brain keeps going to the catastrophizing of situations, or worse, that they start using terms that are just untrue, where they'll say this always happens or it's never, right? It becomes a global problem, not this boss never understands me. It's nobody understands me. Like it starts turning into this self negative thinking. So it's being mindful of that, but then I hear movement actually helps. So even though that's not controlling your cognitive thoughts, I've heard that going to take a walk might actually help combat that. And you've studied this. Why is that? Like, so you're having those self-negative thoughts. We want to stop the ants, right? Automatic negative thoughts in the brain. And they say, go take a walk and you'll feel better. It doesn't sound like it would work, but why does that work? Because I hear it does.
It does. So I like how you were saying this, and let me quickly talk about it. So what you were trying to explain about being fixated on the negative is actually the 3 Ps: pervasiveness, permanence, and personalization. And even happens to normative people too. And I imagine it, especially when people experience ADHD, is personalization. This is my problem. This is something wrong with me. They are targeting me because of my neurodivergence, right? It's very easy to say this problem is, so they personalize the problem, right? Then pervasiveness. This always happens to me. And so automatically, like now you stacked it up with then the third one, which is the permanence, is this cannot be changed. This always happens to me. I've tried everything and there really is no way forward. And that's how we box ourselves, right? So it's something to watch out for, not just for neurodivergent people, for everybody, right? It's like when we get ourselves locked into these 3 Ps, we basically are caging ourselves. And so it's ask the question, is it really true that this only happens to me? It's not likely the case. There are other people that this happens to, right? Is it truly that it always happens? No, if it always happens, then you're not living life. There are other things that happen in your life and it's not, yes, and it is not permanent. So how do you shift that? You cannot battle the mind with the mind. You cannot fight thoughts with thoughts, at least not initially, because it's all a conversation in your head. That's what he said. That's not what he said. Well, that's so silly. Oh, no, that's not so silly. Oh, well, why do you think so? Well, I'm trying to think of a way forward. Well, but really, I don't see a way forward. And so that back and forth conversation in the head causes even more overwhelm because you're trying to battle the positive and negative thoughts at the same time in the head. And then, of course, overwhelm. Exactly. The mind explodes. Not literally, but yes. And so why does it work? By dropping from the mind into the body, you're activating other sense of knowing that your body or you as a human has, right? So it's also like activating, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is all connected to the body, right? And so just the movement, like I said earlier on, increases blood flow. And just by the increase of blood flow, increases oxygenation. You're forced to take deeper breaths, which in itself is calming. And actually preparing for this podcast, I was looking at different studies. There are a couple of studies. There's actually a study about physical activity and ADHD. And the study, I think I can send a letter if anyone wants to see, but it was like the effect of dance movement therapy on health-related psychological outcomes. And particularly, they looked at ADHD, and it was determined that physical activities like rhythmic exercises like dance help improve attention, executive functioning, and overall behavior due to the neurochemical benefits of exercise, right? And that's exactly the key. Moving our bodies gives us, it's like it gives us the good drugs, right? It's like, yeah, the dopamine, the endorphins, the serotonin. And when we do it together with others in a group setting, also gives us the oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, where we feel connected, right? And so getting up and going on a walk, or inviting a body to go on a walk together, right? Going on a run. Or if you were constrained with time and you could not go elsewhere, on the phone call or on a Zoom call with my clients, I say, all right, stop. We need to shift your attention. We're going to do 50 jumping jacks. Are you ready? Yes, great. And then we go, right? And so I'm going 50, and we count down and I get to 20. And then I go 20, 20, 20, 20. Like a broken record. And I go 25, 26, 10. Now, that also interrupts the pattern, right? Because I've not only used the power of movement to shift their focus, but I've also used things like laughter, right? Which again adds to it. So now all in the same spot, you're getting your oxygenation of the blood, you're increasing your heart rate, you're getting your endorphins, and now you're also getting laughter, right? And so all of that in that moment, when you feel good, you do good.
Right.
And when you feel good, you are in a much more positive emotional state to see possible solutions to the problem, to the challenge. It may be a tiny solution, but you're much more able to see it when you're not fixated on the problem.
And what I think is interesting as you're talking, I think about when ADHD is normally first diagnosed, although more adults are finding out they have it as well. But we start to see it as a problem when kids go to school and the movement stops, right? They're forced to sit for 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And then we start seeing the problems. And then I think about everything we were talking about with adults in the beginning. Well, and I think about how much medication has went up, where people are taking more anti-anxiety medications. And the lack of movement, in addition to stressful environments, like you're just putting together this whole story. I do think it's something interesting, though, because I find that there was a phrase I used to use, especially when I worked out and about, that I find a body in motion stays in motion. And when I started working from home over a decade ago, I found, and to this day, I sometimes have a hard time getting myself out of the house. Like I will almost look for reasons to not leave. But as soon as I make the jump and force myself out, I don't necessarily feel a desire to hurry and go back. So I do feel like a body in motion stays in motion. And for those of you that know families where they have like their kids going here and there, like Damilare, you're running the triathlon. And then if your wife said, go to the store, you're probably like, no problem, because you're already out and about. But if you were at home, comfortable on the couch, and your wife came to you and said, would you go to the grocery store? You'd be like, no, because you're not in motion. And so I do think that like sometimes we hear this and we're like, oh, it'd be good to take a walk, but there's so many excuses. It's almost like starting an old lawnmower that like, if you're not moving, it's actually hard to get moving. And then to the same vein, the people that like exercise regularly and they seem to have like this good balance, they're a body in motion. So how do you start that rusty engine? Because you've been sitting at your desk for the last 5 years and you're like, I hear what they're saying and I'll take a walk to go get a coffee, but they'll do it for a while, but they end up right back at their desk.
Yeah. So start small and build habits into your day that allow movement. It's very simple. And I can think of a lot of examples. So again, I'm not advocating for, actually, no, it's not the case. I was going to say I'm not advocating for spending your money in a coffee shop every day. It's up to you. But when I worked at the University of Michigan at the International Center for a couple of years, a few of my colleagues in the morning, when we get in, we'll quickly go for coffee together. So we get into the office, settle in, go grab coffee and come back. So that walk from our office building to the student union and back is movement, get movement, right? And then during lunch, even though we have lunch in like the big conference room, there's at least two of my colleagues who I know, like without fail, every day they come in, they wrap up their lunch in like 5-10 minutes, and the rest of the time they go on a walk and then come back. So now we got to walk in the morning, we got to walk in the afternoon, and then in the evening, from where you park your car to where the building is, that's an additional walk, right? So in a day, you will get a movement at least 3 times a day. Now that's when you go into a physical space. Now, when we're having Zoom meetings and not going into a physical space, it's creating that. So I was in a Zoom meeting, not yesterday, the day before, and right when the meeting was going to start, I told the person I was meeting with, I said, is it okay that, I take this meeting on a walk? And she's like, yeah, not a problem. Actually, now that you say that, can I go on the treadmill while we do the meeting? I said, of course. And so with me being bold enough to make a request to say, hey, I would rather not be seated during this meeting, also give her the permission to say, hey, I could be on the treadmill during this meeting. And what did we do? We did not only get the benefits of movement, we also compressed time, because now she doesn't have to create an extra time in her day
to do that,
to go work out, because we were able to do that while on the meeting. And so she's on the treadmill, she's got a computer in front of her. And okay, not everybody can afford a treadmill at home. Okay, fine. But what I'm saying in essence is, if you find the way, so the first thing is being creative about making a way to make it work. The second is, when we do it for ourselves, we give other people the permission to do it.
And that's the catalyst to beginning change. I even tell folks that, like, sometimes they're like, but I'm like tied to my computer and I have to type, and I'll be like, change your scenery. If you have a laptop, if you can, even if you're still sitting, go sit outside if you can have that meeting, or stand during your meeting. Those stand desks, like, it's not a lot of movement, but it's still changing your posture, changing the environment. Like you said, start small where you can, because maybe then you'll start to see the benefits.
Right. And use the tools. So I don't have to be typing all the time. What happened to voice dictation? To type it, right? I mean, because again, and it's using all those things that technology is available. It facilitates connectivity. Rather than have it take over our lives, we could use it for the benefits to enhance our lives, right? And so when I can talk, I'll dictate what I'm about to write. Why shouldn't I? Right? Why shouldn't I? And the question is, how do you go from 0 to 1, right? To whatever it is. And it's, like I said, not just starting small, but understanding that we cannot come to life with everything needing to be 100% or perfect.
Right.
For some, it's like, all right, for the next week, I'm going to commit to 5 minutes of movement every day. And identifying what that time is and blocking that time on your calendar.
Yep.
And then start. That's it. Or saying, well, next time on the couch, when I need a drink, I'm not going to ask my kid to go bring me a glass of water. I'm going to choose to get up from the couch, to go to the fridge and grab me a glass of water.
Right.
That could be somewhere to start. Like, make it so simple that your brain thinks, oh, you must be really silly to not do that. And then celebrate the win and then build on it.
And it's the prioritization. It is an interesting thing. And then I think we have more time, but we're almost at the end of our time together today.
Okay.
It's the prioritization. It's one of the things where, like, we have been talking about trying to make time, and people say they don't have time. But I do believe, because I've seen it, we make time for the things we really have to. So there will be people that are like, I don't have time. And I think it's the perception of importance, or, like you said, the receptivity of the ask. If you told your boss you had to go to the dentist today, you would have no problem saying, I have to go to the dentist. And you would take the time and you would go. Right? If you had to go to a medical test, you would tell your boss, like, so we believe like they're receptive to that. But if you're like, oh, I have to go to the soccer game, it's almost like, as a culture, we have not prioritized family over health. And so that leads to it. So I just want to throw that to our audience that we make time for the things that matter most. When we say we don't have time or we've ran out of time, really look at what you prioritize that day, because if you really wanted to, you'd make that happen.
Correct. And just, a couple of things to wrap it up here with the prioritization is to live with intention. Live with intention as much as you can. When you know the things that really matter to you, then put the thought into creating a plan at a time to, incorporate that into your day-to-day life. That little extra time of planning to do it makes a lot of difference. And if you have struggles with planning, ask somebody to help you, right? Because not everybody's as good with planning. We know that, especially with the neurodivergent audience. Ask for help so that you create that structure. And so you don't have to think about it every day as like, oh, well, when today am I going to try to do this? Right. So that, and the movement hacks of every day, right? The 50 jumping jacks. I love it, quickly. Yeah. That, another hack too is, just rubbing your earlobes. So like using your thumb and your index finger, you have to rub your earlobes and just rub it. It actually works. It energizes you, kind of just, makes me awake. Another one that I would do is use, again, my thumb and my four fingers and then just, massage my forehead, makes me more alert. And there's a lot more to that, that helps. But it's finding that balance between living with the intention and when you're caught in a pinch, using these hacks to help energize yourself.
And so if our listeners want to learn more about these hacks and ways to live more intentionally, especially incorporating more movement, the natural drug to mental wellness, how can they reach out to you?
Absolutely. So my website is joyinsideout.com. So the word joy, insideout.com, or my name, Damilare Adeyeri.com. It leads to the same site. And there they could find me, right? They could find me with information for speaking opportunities, for coaching, for tips, and, just a reinforcement of the power of movement and joy to living, I want to say successful life, but beyond that, it's really a fulfilled life.
And I can't thank you enough for helping us on that journey. Audience, you don't have to live in burnout. And there are resources. And if you just want a quick fix, you could even check out his TED Talk, where he actually will lead you through an exercise to help increase your movement. So please be intentional. Thank you for your time today. And thank you, Damilare, for being part of our chat.
Thank you, Dr. Theresa Haskins, for inviting me. This is great.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Work Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.